It was real nice to meet you. Hope you learned what I had to teach you. Got my chips stacked up to beat you.
Have you ever fantasized about taking revenge on someone who wronged you, or someone who wronged someone close to you? Have you ever thought about inflicting awful pain or fatal wounds on people that just, deserve it, but whom the justice system is not going to dish out that justice to? I suppose these are things, hopefully, you would never actually carry out. These are hopefully just fantasies in your head, and these fantasies don't just play out in our heads, they sometimes play out in fiction too, and I think that's part of what is going on in the story that I'll be talking about today on the show, The Adventures of Ma Suzhen. My guest for the episode is going to be the translator of this book, Mr. Paul Bevan of Oxford University, no less. He'll be coming on after the news segment, the Terrific News, the translated Chinese fiction news. Actually, I'm telling a little bit of a lie. There's something I'm going to do first. We'll do it very quickly. I'll just ask you to review the show. So if you can leave this podcast rather, a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or anywhere that you can leave a review, that would be wonderful. It would just be a great way to say thanks if you're a big fan of the show. It will help the show reach more people. That's the point. That's what I'm seeking to do, really. I'm not trying to profit. I guess I'm just trying to become famous. That's my selfish agenda here. Become famous on the internet and reach more listeners. So yeah, self-indulgent begging aside, we'll go on to the Terrific News, the translated Chinese fiction news. So 4 items today. The first one is something you can listen to. It's another podcast. It is a podcast episode from a show called The Arts of Travel, and it's an interview with a sinologist, Sabina Knight, Dr. Sabina Knight, and Sabina will be talking in this podcast about China's literature. It's a part 1. I don't know if there's going to be future installments, but in this part 1 she's talking about Taoism, Confucianism and anti-war poetry from Chinese literature. Sounds pretty cool. Don't forget as well, you can follow Sabina on Twitter. She's quite active there. It's twitter.com. Why am I saying that? I should just say her handle, which would be at Sabina Knight 1. So I'm sure you can find her. Okay, next news item. It's something you can read. It's an interview between 2 individuals who came on the show together, Shen Yang and Nikki Harman, so an author and her translator. So I guess they're just talking about the subject matter of the book, which we did actually cover on the show, More Than One Child. They're talking about being born illegal, what it was like growing up as an excess birth daughter. So just the author and the translator speaking to each other. These 2 are pals, which I think often makes for the best interviews. A friendly relationship between the interrogator and the interrogatee. That's up on the Penn translation, Penn Literature Word Translations blog, penntransmissions.com. But of course the link will be in the show notes. Now, third news item, this is a story from a book that was covered on the show, which you can now read online for free. It's The Old Cicada by Tan Shui. That's up on a webpage for you to read. It's the Words Without Borders campus website. Again, a link will be in the show notes. I don't know if I've got anything particularly wise to say here, just that it is a interesting Tan Shui story. It's on one hand less sort of I always struggle with that word, disorienting. It's not disorientating, isn't it? It's just disorienting. Anyway, it's less weird and confusing than many of her stories, but there is like a subtle strangeness to it, working out exactly what it might mean, or what it is trying to communicate rather than what it means, if you see what I mean. Mean. Okay, 4th news item. This is I picked this one because of my hardcore Scottish bias, basically. It's an event. It's not an online event, it's in person, and you've got to be in like Perth or Kinross to attend this in like rural Scotland. So pretty much none of you are going to be able to make it, I think, unless anyone's listening from like Dundee or St Andrews. It's a former guest of the show is going to be doing a reading of translations from ancient China. So you may have guessed that's Brian Holton. The event's called Hard Roads and Cold Hearst Winds. I'll just read the little event bio just so you can get a picture of this event that you're probably not going to be able to make it to. Hard Roads and Cold Hearst Winds is a collection of Scots translations of poetry by Li Bai and Du Fu, two of the most renowned poets of ancient China. By bringing two of the world's great poets from the oldest continuous literary tradition in the world into the library of Scots writing, Holton creates a text as valuable in its own way to the literary tradition as Lorimer's wonderful New Testament in Scots. Holton's skillfully supple verse is composed in a literary Scots, inflected by his native dialect, giving rise to a natural phrasing that draws on his intimate knowledge of the border ballads. He's from the Scottish borders, by the way. Complemented by a collaboration with Edinburgh-based calligrapher Zhang, these finely wrought translations create a strikingly beautiful book, inclusive of introductory essays on the poets, notes on the text, and a reflective postscript. And then the second paragraph is just a bio of Brian's, so I'll skip that part. So if you are actually in Scotland, somewhere in proximity of Crieff, you can book this thing for £6 on Eventbrite. You got to show up on the 23rd of April, which is a Saturday, 5 to 6 p.m. And it's at Inner Peffrey Library. Inner Peffrey. It's a good place name, isn't it? Inner Peffrey Library. So, yep, that is of course that's definitely the news item I should have spent the most time on. Of course, that makes the most sense. Nonsensical, questionable decisions aside, let's go on to a book. Let's go on to a discussion about a book where the main character does not question her own decisions at all. She just gets the hell on with it, like I should be doing. That book is The Adventures of Ma Suzhen, and I'll be talking to Paul Bevan, its translator, in like 2 seconds when the interview begins. So goodbye from Introduction Angus, and Interview Angus will be saying hello to you in like a second. Okay, so on the show we have Paul Bevan. Very exciting to have you here, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak on your podcast.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Your book and yourself were recommended to me by Helen Wang, she's sort of an invisible presence on the show. She's never been on herself, but I'm sure she's been mentioned, and she's a friend to lots of past guests, or a contact to lots of past guests. So she's making herself felt again. But enough about Helen, more about you, Paul. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, at the moment, I am departmental lecturer in modern Chinese literature and culture at the University of Oxford. And so, at the moment I'm teaching and researching, but before that, and I've been teaching in Oxford since 2013, on and off, not as a full-time job. In 2018 to 20, I had a different sort of job, which was in a museum as Christensen Fellow in Chinese painting at the Ashmolean Museum.
Oh yeah.
And so that sort of shows my interests are really literature and art, and where the two meet. And so you can see that in the books that I write. They're very much on both art and literature. Yeah. Yeah,
and we'll get into it later, but there's a bit of a multimedia angle to the book we're going to be talking about today, which is The Adventures of Ma Suzhen. Just wanted to mention the Ashmolean. I visited that just the once, and I think I knew it was going to have bits and bobs from all over the world, but there was a very cool Chinese, I don't know if you call it an exhibit, but some of the items on display, obviously my being who I am, I'm looking like a hawk for absolutely anything Chinese or even East Asian. And the two things I remember that were there were one was some sort of modern style, I don't remember the artist, but quite modern style portraits of various figures. I think one of them was Lu Xun, so that gives us an idea of the window of time there. But the other was an artist from Quanzhou, I think, or at least from Fujian province, where Quanzhou is, who makes art using explosions, he marks gunpowder. I forgot his name, but that was an uncanny moment. I'm really just talking to listeners here, Paul. I apologize if this means nothing to you, but I'd seen one of his works before in Quanzhou in the Fujian Taiwan Friendship Museum, a very PRC style museum, but it was amazing. There's this huge tree he painted using controlled explosions. And then it was such a pleasure to go wandering into the Ashmolean and seeing that mainland Chinese artist being featured there. So yeah, just Ashmolean and Chinese stuff. I can't say enough. Oh, I have said enough. So I'll let you talk.
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, it's got an excellent modern Chinese collection, and that's what it's famous for, is the modern Chinese painting collection in particular. But of course, there are the galleries there, the Chinese galleries, that don't change as much, and they are also very important as far as museums in this country go from the point of view of China. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the modern aspect, I guess, is what I enjoyed, because although this podcast host has a tagline, all eras, all genres, all ideologies, I can definitely admit I have some personal sort of favorites, and I don't really lean towards the classical stuff.
Right.
I don't hate it, not at all, but definitely the modern world is what I find interesting in Chinese lit.
Yes.
Although I guess that is not a narrow term in itself, because we're looking at something that definitely feels very modern in some ways, but it's like the modernist era, not the postmodern world, I guess. Yeah, I've kept teasing what the book is about, and although I'm very tempted to ask you right off, what on earth is it about? First, I'll ask you, what's your relationship to the text in question here?
Okay, well, I mean, that actually goes back to 2017, and I was doing a class at SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies in London, and I was actually standing in for Frances Wood, and Frances Wood had chosen some books. It's a class on the book in China. So she'd chosen some books, and along with those books, which were all very interesting in themselves, there were also some nianhua prints and some popular prints as well. And one of those prints had a figure on it called Ma Yongzhen. Now, Ma Yongzhen, I had no idea who he was, but it was so interesting to see this figure. He was lifting dumbbells, and he had nunchucks on the ground, and so he was some sort of martial artist. So I went and looked into who he was, and that's when I found, in fact, through looking him up, I found this book. And this book, I just started reading it, and I thought, hang on, this is a wonderful book. I can't stop turning the pages. I need to do something about this. So I read it several times and found it, absolutely fascinating every time I read it. And that, yes, so once I finished reading it, I thought, yeah, I think it would be nice to translate it. And so when my job finished at the Ashmolean, it was just at the time that the lockdown was beginning. I only had 3 weeks to go when the lockdown started. That's when I began translating it. And it took me a year to translate it and to write the essay, which is also in the book. And then it took just a little while longer to actually get it published.
Right. So I'm curious about something here, because Ma Yongzhen, he's not our main character in this book. Our main character, as the title maybe suggests, is Ma Suzhen, and they're siblings. And I guess to boil it down to a nutshell, Ma Yongzhen is a gangster, or he's sort of involved in the underworld in old Shanghai. And in this book, he's been killed. He's been murdered by some other gangsters. And Ma Suzhen, his sister, ventures from her home, or their family home in Shandong, to go get vengeance. And in your sort of supplementary, I've trouble remembering what was in the intro and what was in the essay afterwards. But in either case, you explained in the paratext that Ma Yongzhen was a real, well, number one, he was a real guy in history. And number two, there's quite a lot of fiction in written form, but also like plays and movies about him. And Ma Suzhen appears in some of those other outputs as well. So I'm just curious if have any other books or stories involving these characters ever been translated to English, or if other languages, or is this a first?
I think as far as books go, I think it's almost certainly a first. There are films, and some of the films, the later films from the 70s and the 80s, are quite well known as martial arts films. Because as you rightly say, Ma Yongzhen was a gangster, a martial artist, a performing strongman in particular, and he died in 1879. The thing about him is you can find newspaper articles on his death, because he was murdered quite horribly. All the details are there for several days in the Shanghai newspapers, in Shenbao, the daily paper in Shanghai. And his sister, Ma Suzhen, is not a real person. She was made up. Although prior to the book being published in 1923, she was reported in some magazines, etc., as his wife. And I don't know if he had a wife or not. It's actually very difficult to find out the real history of Ma Suzhen that is not just what's written in the newspaper. But many things followed on from that. The 1923 book. There was a film in 1927 by the Mingxing Company, which was a very, very popular film at the time. And then it went from there. But there were other books about Ma Suzhen at the time. I've not been able to track down any of these. The point about this sort of literature, it was popular literature that hasn't necessarily survived in libraries.
Yeah. You mentioned there that you hadn't heard of the guy, this Ma Suzhen, before until you picked up the book, and then you learned he's this popular figure that's spawned this whole extended universe. No, it's not an extended universe. I'm abusing the term there, but like this whole extended library of other media. So I'm just wondering, did you have this sort of funny situation where you learn about this thing and you realize you're sort of late to the party, and then other people you're in contact with, maybe quite likely Chinese colleagues or friends, have known about this figure like all their lives? Did you find that?
That's absolutely the case. I mean, I must say, after I found out about him, how did I find out? Obviously on the internet to start with. And when you go onto the internet and you put in Ma Suzhen and Ma Suzhen as well, you will find several films which are very, as I said, famous martial arts films. And, I started watching this. I've watched the films. There are 2 drama series, lengthy drama series, which they both appear in. And so I got to know them from that. But as you're quite right to say that, he's a sort of almost, as I say in my introduction to the book, almost a household name in China. And even there is I've even seen a children's book about it.
Interesting. So I'm going to go to that question that I was tempted to earlier about the plot. So I guess I already gave a really basic version. Do you want to expand at all on what I described?
Yeah, I mean, so Ma Suzhen is at home and she falls asleep and she dreams of her brother. And in the dream, the brother comes and says, I have been murdered. You must come and take revenge. And so after much toing and froing, going to soothsayers and discussing with her relatives, she decides she must go to Shanghai. And so the first half of the book is her travels to Shanghai, at which time she encounters all sorts of people who are either downtrodden or mistreated particularly by wealthy people, and so she takes revenge for them as well. But what's interesting about the book, I think, is the fact that the 2 halves are completely different. So the first half is much more like has some elements of martial arts and a martial arts novel, but it is not really a martial arts novel. When she halfway through the book, exactly halfway through the book, she then arrives in Shanghai, and the whole tone of it changes. So it becomes more like the sort of urban novel that you would have found by writers such as Zhang Henshui and Bao Tianxiao. So people who wrote in the genre of the so-called, I don't like the term, but I use it here, the Mandarin Ducks and Butterflies literature, popular literature of the time. So the second half is very, very different. And I have to say, the second half is much more exciting than the first half. It takes a long time for the story to get going. And it really kicks off in the second half.
When it started off, it almost felt like I was reading something out of Hero 1,000 Faces, like this sort of point for point mythical journey. She's called to adventure. She has to go on little side quests on the way to help people, and it's all leading somewhere further down the line. So I guess on one hand, that made the first half a bit disjointed because it felt like little mini episodes, whereas the second half, it's much more of a conventional type plot. But compounding on that, those opening episodes just weren't as interesting pieces of drama, I didn't think, compared with when it gets much more personal And
I absolutely agree.
there's more subterfuge, and there's the humor. There's more humor, I think, in the second half as well, and the characters are more vibrant. So it's not just the plot that gets more interesting; it's the way it's handled, I think.
Absolutely right. And why is that? Because they're written by different people. The first half
Right.
is written by someone completely different from the second half. Or one imagines they were friends, but I'm not really quite sure. I think we'll come to that a bit later, won't we?
Yeah, it's funny. I was listening to a podcast a few days ago. It was an interview with the horror writer Ramsey Campbell, who was talking about, well, lots of different things, but he talked about his feelings of inadequacy at times when he had to sort of play writing games with the writers. There's some show he was on in the 90s where he was gathered with a load of other, I think, UK and American horror writers, and they had to collaborate and write a story. And he didn't really know what he was doing, despite being one of the big names in the genre. He just sort of, he said, if anyone watches the show and they pay attention to him, they'll see him not contributing very much and fumbling. And then he described another time when he was paired up with an author called Poppy Z. Bright, another big name. And I think they were supposed to write a book together. She wrote the first chapter or something, and he just didn't know how to follow it up at all. So yeah, it's just a funny coincidence there that dual collaborative novels, I guess we don't hear about them much, but they are a feature in the literary landscape, and they're quite a weird feature, I think.
In this case, it certainly is unusual because they are completely different, the first and the second half. But in fact, the book itself, the whole book, is the second volume of a much longer story. The first volume is the story of Ma Suzhen himself. And that, again, was written by the same two writers, Zhu Daogong and Qi Fanyou. And it's very, very difficult to work out who did what and why. And so that's why, I have said that the book is attributed to Qi Fanyou and Zhu Daogong rather than it is by them. Because, for example, Zhu Daogong at the end, he says, oh, this second half was, the first half was written by Qi Fanyou. And the second half of the book was written by Zhu Daogong. So he says, my half is not as good as Qi Fanyou's, and this sort of thing. And well, I would dispute that because I think his half is much, much more interesting, as we've discussed. But that's exactly the same as happens. The same sort of thing happens in the first volume to do with the story of Ma Suzhen. And it has to be said that that story of Ma Suzhen is nowhere near as interesting as the story of Ma Suzhen, and that's why I've translated this second volume rather than both of them.
You read my mind there, and that's exactly what I was going to ask. Would you ever want to go back and translate that first one and try and get it published, or do you think it's not really worth it for readers?
It's a possibility. It is a possibility, but it's just not as interesting. It's just it shows very much about how his prowess as a great martial artist and strongman, which is interesting in itself, I have to say. And I have written an essay on Ma Suzhen, which will be published maybe in a couple of years. It takes so long to publish some of these things. And so I do find it interesting, but I just don't think that book is going to appeal to as wider audience as this one probably should.
Okay, so in the next set of questions, we're going to make it blindingly apparent why this book is so interesting. But before we go into that, I'll just ask you really directly, could you sum up what makes the thing interesting?
I think what makes this book particularly interesting is the fact that it has Ma Suzhen as the heroine or hero, or however we want to term her, as opposed to focusing on her brother and what happens to her in a period which is admittedly not very clear when it actually takes place, but a period when the women's rights were being recognized a little bit more in the Republican period, and women had more freedom. Here she is, a woman. Admittedly, she has to disguise herself as a man, but she travels across the country from Shandong to Shanghai and performs all sorts of feats of bravery. So I think that's what makes it particularly interesting.
Totally, yes. Gosh, what was I going to say? I know what I was going to say. I was going to say you've led me perfectly into my next question, which is about where are we and when are we? So the where is At first, you'd think kind of simple. We start off in somewhere in Shandong, we end up in Shanghai, although the places in between are in the question I got written down on the page, I used the word liminal, like they're just sort of random little places. Again, it reminded me of some like a mythic story where someone's on the path. Nothing is on the path except like say an individual house in the woods or something. It had almost like that fairy tale vibe to me. But the real ambiguous point, like you said, is when, because like you were saying earlier, the real Ma Yongzhen was, I guess, a guy of the late Qing, but I used the words old Shanghai to describe Shanghai, and that was a very purposeful choice. I was thinking of the Shanghai that people like Paul French dedicate their whole careers to, basically, the city of devils, like sort of jazz, crime, Eastern and Western cultural cross pollination. That's the word I'm looking for. An exciting and dangerous and very culturally rich and unique place to be. And it did feel like that's kind of what we're seeing in the book, but also it's not, it could quite as easily, I think, pass for the late Qing. And you even I believe in your, I forget if it's your intro or your essay at the end, but you point to sort of contradictory evidence that basically mean it's an impossible story because it seems to be happening in both times. Could you go into that a bit more?
Yeah, so the story should be happening after his death, which is 1879. So immediately after his death. So it could be as late as 1880. But the strange thing about it is that there are incidents that happen. For example, close to the beginning, they talk about the funeral of a very wealthy man that took place, and how fabulous it was to see so many people on the streets, etc., etc. But in fact, that funeral didn't take place until much later. I can't remember quite what the date is, but I think it might be 1917. But then the book itself was written in 1923, and since that time, there are various ideas of how it should be portrayed. So you get it sometimes set in the Qing dynasty, sometimes set in the Republican period, so after 1911. And so it's a little bit of a mess from that point of view. But in this case, it is very much a hodgepodge. There is a flavor of the 19th century, but there are also things which couldn't possibly happen. For example, when she goes she goes and hears some Chinese opera, some Peking opera. And they have scenery, for example, and they have the most modern ways of performing performing Peking opera, which didn't come in until the 20th century.
Right, yeah. Use the word hodgepodge and mess to describe how those time periods have been mixed up in the story. But I kind of wonder, even if the authors had no intention to create a confusing, mixed up sort of timescape to set the story in, if we think about the whole death of the author thing, that we can interpret it how we like, regardless of intentions or mistakes. The word I might throw in instead of hodgepodge is cocktail.
That's a much nicer word.
It's more complimentary, but fiction can do many amazing things, even when it's not trying to be sort of strange and almost science fictional, mixing up time. They've gone and made this story which is set in multiple times at once, and that was part of the appeal to me in a way that I don't think it's this simple, but you could say that we start off in sometime in the late 1800s in Shandong, and then as Ma Suzhen is sort of marching or riding her horse or whatever towards Shanghai, she's kind of moving forward through time in a way as well.
That's a nice way of looking at it. Yes, I didn't think of it that way. I sort of feel more that it's a story of. That's a nice way of looking at it. So I see it more as a story that is for a modern audience of 1923, which shows a time in which everyone will have known of. Even at that time, people will have still known about Ma Yongzhen and possibly Ma Suzhen, but not, I imagine, not really, because she was made up for the book and for the films. But so it's looking, but it's like a historical film for a modern audience of the 1920s.
Right. Yes. sensible. This is often what happens because I'm just the interviewer and there's no burden on me to come up with clever ideas. I often throw out the bizarre nonsense that my guests then sort of politely reply with some common sense. I wanted to ask another not very common sense question about those liminal places, or what I'm calling liminal places in between her home in Shandong and where she's getting to in Shanghai. Just at all, is there anything you would say about the in-between places she goes to that is worth remarking on?
I think they're places that they're like stage scenes, that she goes from one to another and she performs her acts of bravery and of her form of justice, which is to take from the rich and give to the poor, to slay the aggressors against the poor, and these sort of things, which happen in turn. I mean, there is a clear trail that happens from Shandong to Shanghai, but it does take this form of specific things that happen along the way, and it is really the case of her and her sense of justice.
Yes, and you've led me perfectly again to my next question about justice. So it's a revenge story basically, and justice is an interesting thing because it can be served up in many forms, and here it's, I guess, in the form of revenge. I can't really think of any other way that justice is dealt out in this story. Although we might think of revenge as being a pretty straightforward, simple thing, there's lots of curious and interesting things about it. Like, is revenge ever right? Does revenge actually give us closure? What else? Would it be okay to build revenge into like our criminal justice system? All these things. So how do you think it plays out in the story in a philosophical or ethical way?
I think in the case of Ma Suzhen, she thinks she has one goal in mind, that is to take revenge for her brother. She succeeds, and that is the end of the story. This is the important thing about the story. But what happens along the way is she meets with different people who have different ideas of what justice is. Obviously, in the first half of the book, there's a case of, there's a court case about the murders she commits, although she's not implicated in them because it's just a cover-up to promote the jobs of the wealthy people who appear. If you read the book, you'll understand what I mean. But so there's this form of court justice, which, and at that point, it's quite interesting because it takes the form. There are elements in it where you can see the idea of the Gong'an court fiction that had been popular in China for a long, long time, since the Song dynasty, but up until the Qing dynasty, and into the 20th century. And then there is the justice of those who had taken revenge already for the injustices that they thought Ma Yongjun had acted upon them. So they are the gangsters. They are the gangsters who killed him. So all these people have their own idea of what justice is throughout the book.
I'm sort of reminded of, I don't know, I couldn't really rattle off the names of any films, but sort of like a 80s or 90s action film where I guess especially an American one where the politicians are corrupt. No one in power can be trusted. So we just need muscle to kill the baddie.
Absolutely.
And like the story, even the narrator just tells us right off the bat, basically, yeah, she's gonna kill these guys that killed her brother. Don't worry, we'll get there. It was weird. And
she has the support of people who are high up in places who are officials also in Shanghai. Her great friend, who is a friend of her, of her brother, works at the Yamen, works at the official as an official, and he's in support of her. And as are most of the people from Shandong who live in Shanghai at the time, who think they are badly treated by the people in Shanghai. So there are lots of different layers to that.
Yeah, I kind of wondered what the sort of deal, what the contract, unspoken contract was between the writers and the readers, because we already said it's got elements of like kung fu fiction, it's got elements of like an urban novel, and one of the more interesting things I remember from back when I was an undergrad, it was actually a film genre module, and we were introduced to the sort of this theory that in writing about genres. And the thing that stuck with me is that one can argue genres, be it in film or in novels, are like a contract where the audience or the readers go in with certain expectations, they spend their money on a book, and in return, the author doesn't give them sort of an avant-garde, completely individual, unique thing that is like nothing else. They give them a story that hits certain moments, follows certain patterns, and human beings, being what we are for whatever reason, seem to enjoy that. And if the contract is broken, that can ruin the experience, or if it's broken in a playful way, it could make the novel even more rewarding. So I just kind of wondered, like, when we're told right off the bat, Ma Suzhen's going to get what she wants and slaughter her enemies, and when she does it kind of brutally. Is it just is it as straightforward as it seems, do you think, or are the readers supposed to find it ironic or funny or gruesome, or is it just pure satisfaction?
I think it's the reader is supposed to know exactly what's going to happen all the way through the book to a certain extent, or not, certainly not to be surprised by anything. But there's a little, it is told in a slightly different way. It is not necessarily, as I said, not the typical martial arts novel. It's much more like a play or a film. So, and that is something that you don't necessarily get in other novels of that time. And so the way it's told might be a little different, but I think the reader always knows what's going to come up, that justice will be served, whatever that justice is.
Yeah, the influence of visual mediums on novels is interesting. This is something I heard like third hand through a podcast who was relating something they heard from someone else, saying there's some kind of book or an essay or something by this guy who was writing, I think in like the 70s, and was commenting on how films had influenced novels, how novels had sort of what's the word, begun to follow a sort of scene by scene structure, and that authors of novels were using flashbacks, a technique that they had probably absorbed from films rather than from reading other books. So it's just interesting to think that this isn't necessarily limited to films introducing novels. It could be the theater influencing novels, even as far back as the 1920s in China.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't take a great leap of the imagination to see the sense in that. It's interesting.
No, I think that's right. I mean, what you find in Chinese film is particularly, well, throughout, because as I say, the 1927 film of Ma Yongzhen was based on the book of 1923, but even up into, the 1980s, 90s, and right up until now, not so much recently, but for a long time in the 80s and 90s, films were based on books. So many films were based on books, and I think that happens also in the 1930s.
I think that was all the questions I had about revenge. So my next question is phrased as a hilarious pun. I'm so proud of this one. What do you think? So what do we think about the woman, the central Nuren female character? And I asked this because I went in not quite knowing what to expect, because I read the blurb which said this is going to be an urban and kung fu kind of story, but on the cover we have a very modern, non-threatening sort of woman who seems like she's in Shanghai. And at the opening of the book, we're in what seems to be a more traditional Chinese household, where I think all the people there are ladies. They don't seem especially dangerous. They don't seem like warriors. But then all of those expectations I might have had were cut to pieces by the end of the book. So, like, who the hell is Ma Suzhen? How do we describe her?
Okay, so the front cover of the book has a picture of Ma Suzhen. Well, it doesn't have a picture of Ma Suzhen.
Right.
It has a picture of a woman who I imagine is how Ma Suzhen looks when she's on the boat, going over she dresses as a modern woman of the time. Now, although we are supposed to be talking about the 19th century, I chose an image from circa 1915 for that, because I think it comes right in the center of what we're talking about. And I sort of immediately thought when I saw that image that that was how she would appear on the boat coming over. The only time she dresses in women's clothes, in fact. But that particular image, it has a story behind it as well, because a long time ago on eBay, I bought a set of cigarette cards, which were advertised as Japanese cigarette cards of women. And so I bought these. I immediately recognized them as Chinese. And when I got them, there's a set of 30 cards showing women, and they are actually from around 1915, that sort of period.
Oh, nice.
And so they are a very rare set of cards, but they are absolutely fascinating, showing women doing all sorts of things, everything you can imagine, riding a train by themselves, on a tram, tiger hunting, going fishing, all sorts of things, riding a bicycle, for example. And then, I mean, from that point of view, we were talking about these specific cards. I did some research, ended up reading Louise Edwards' reasonably new book, Citizens of Beauty, Drawing Democratic Dreams in Republican China, in which I was surprised to find images of these particular cigarette cards. So that's opened up a whole field for me, which may well turn into another book in the future, because it's a very, very interesting thing to look at. The images of women, particularly from this newspaper, or the supplement to a newspaper, the Da Gonghe Ribao, what's it called? Da Gonghe Huabao, which is absolutely fascinating. So anyway, that's slightly bit off the track of what we're talking about. But I think, it shows how enthusiastic I was to find this image, which I think reflects very well how Ma Suzhen appears halfway through the story.
Right. It's interesting that pack of cards has all these women alone doing all these different things, from mundane things like riding a train, like you said, to fighting a tiger. Because Ma Suzhen also does quite a lot of different things in a rather often, usually on her own. And when she's not on her own, she never seems to really need anyone else, at least at an existential level. But it never feels particularly complicated. Like no one is particularly shocked that she's a woman, or that she's a woman and able to do all sorts of things on her own. She doesn't get caught up in like a love interest. The fact that she dresses up as a man might be played for comedy once, very briefly, but it's not done for giggles like it could so very easily have been. I don't think she ever loses a fight. I don't want to make it sound like a boring book, but it's just interesting that that's not where the focus is. And I'm not exactly a connoisseur of wuxia or xia stories of any kind, but one thing it does remind me of them is that whether or not it's historically accurate, when a woman becomes one of the Jianghu fighters, it's no big deal. Or if they're in a troop of like 7 or 12 warriors and 1 or 2 or 3 of them are women, it's not a really big deal at all. So I almost have nothing to say about that, because I don't know what I can say, because it's all presented so matter-of-factly.
Well, in the case of Ma Suzhen, she grew up with her brother originally, and they both learned martial arts together. So she was supposedly no less talented than her brother as a martial artist. But, throughout the story itself, she's almost always dressed as a man, and most people don't notice she's a woman. Right. It's only when she tells people she's a woman that people realize. So, although that sounds rather unlikely, considering she's supposedly quite a slight young woman, but no one notices, and she is able to defeat these people because she has trained with her brother. But one of the things where it departs from the typical sort of wuxia novel is that at the beginning she hasn't trained with a monk or a nun or got sort of supernatural powers, which it's very specifically doesn't have elements of the supernatural. And I think that's from the period when it was written, that it was frowned upon in the Republican period to be too superstitious, and that's quite clear the way it's written, because none of the things that happen in the typical wuxia novel, such as flying through the air, that sort of thing, do not appear. She's much more down to earth.
Speaking of sort of attitudes towards what should be in a book and what shouldn't from this era, I think that I found, and this might just say a bit about me as a reader, conspicuously absent is anything Western. Because although Shanghai, at that time especially, it's a colonial city, it's sort of a product of Western interference in China. And again, I mentioned like the old Shanghai of Paul French. For readers like me and a lot of Paul French's readers, the whole appeal there is that it's incredibly cosmopolitan, and there's a lot of people who, to be frankly, probably look a lot like me or you there, so that as well alongside Chinese people who you could take an interest in the story. But it's just not really a thing in this story at all. I think it's mentioned that one of the gang bosses operating in Shanghai is, I don't think it says where he's from, but like he says, he's a Westerner, and his name says that he's blonde or something, but like that's it. And it felt, again, I didn't feel surprised by that, because I figured this is popular genre fiction. It's not trying to impress anyone. It's not trying to modernize Chinese culture with Western literary influences, like say Lu Xun might be doing. Just a bit of entertainment for ordinary people. So yeah, I don't have a question there, but did that strike you as well?
Well, I mean, I can point to other books that don't have, and a notable thing about, for example, Shanghai Chunqiu, which is by Bao Tianxiao, that is very notable for having no foreigners in as well. And I think, this doesn't, it's not unusual. And the person you refer to in the book, who is only referred to, doesn't appear in the book, is called Yellowbeard.
Right.
He was a policeman in the Shanghai police force. And he was a real person. Again, he was the person who, when Ma Yongzhen first came to Shanghai, they had a feat of strength, which actually, quite strangely, was just them holding hands to see who could hurt each other most. And they went around walking around the town hand in hand. And of course, Ma Yongzhen wins in the end.
Have you ever seen the poster from Mao's China of Sino-Soviet friendship?
I've seen several of those.
There's a famous, well, I say famous, it does the rounds on the internet. It's a very buff Asian, presumably Chinese man, and a very buff blonde Russian guy, like standing side by side. Looks like they might be more than friends.
Yes,
just what that reminds me of.
I'm pretty sure I know the sort of thing you mean, possibly even the poster you mean. I doubt that's intentional. It just appeals nowadays.
Yes, it's kind of funny. That does sound like an intense way to fight, though. That my hands aren't strong. I think I'd lose.
Yes, just holding hands.
Yeah, interesting. I was not where I expected that question to go. So excellent. We mentioned wuxia and the wandering xia warriors a few times. So I'll take us to the next section, which is kind of about that. In fact, hang on. Yes, it is kind of about that. Yeah. So the first question would have been the people behind the words. What wandering literary knights wrote the story? But we basically already hit on that point. But my next question was, who sort of handled these characters subsequently? So I sort of flippantly threw out the term extended universe earlier in our conversation, and I'll throw out another awful 21st century word, IP. Who's handled this IP, or is it completely open source IP that all sorts of creators were able to have fun with and rejig without being sued by the Disney or Fox corporations over the decades?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I mentioned, the first film is from 1927, and that's the film that is based on the book. And then after that, there's quite a period before it becomes another film. But we must, the importance of the drama is really worth noting. And then in the 1940s, there was a version of storytelling version, and you can actually even see that on the internet, and it's all spoken word. So unfortunately, because it's mostly in Shanghai dialect, the language, local language of Shanghai, I can only understand a few words. So, but anyway, getting back to what we're talking about, which is actually the films, because much later in the 1970s, there were several films made. One was Taiwanese film from 1972, A Brave Girl Boxer in Shanghai. That's the official English name. Followed by, in 1988, there's Ma Suzhen Takes Revenge, made by the Shanghai Film Studio. And very recently, there's been one which was made actually just in 2020, which is Ma Yongjun Duel in Jiabei, which I haven't seen. That's the one I haven't seen, but hopefully one day I will. The reason I haven't seen it actually because I didn't want it to influence everything that I've been writing about these two people, Ma Yongjun and Ma Suzhen. And so, I mean, and then on top of that are the drama series, on the TV drama series, which are pretty terrible, I have to say. But, you know, that's just the way it is. Some drama series are great, some are terrible. And one in particular was, you know, I watched it all the way through dutifully, but it wasn't really, I wouldn't recommend it.
That's funny. You read my mind again, because my next question was going to be, how do you rate of all these things that are out there which you watched? Like, is there any real crackers?
None. The book, there's no doubt that the book is the best thing about, you know, the story about. I mean, I must say that 1927 film, of course, I haven't seen because it doesn't exist anymore. It's lost. And that's a great pity.
Right.
But apart from, I mean, I've enjoyed the film, particularly the A Brave Girl Boxer in Shanghai in 1972. I enjoyed that, but I wouldn't necessarily watch it again, put it that way.
So Taiwan wins. Outrageous. All my mainland listeners are shaking their fists in fury right now. Not really. I'm sure they're not upset. My next question. I've titled this one "Genre Stacking." So we've name dropped a few genres, but I wonder, like, if we were casting the net as wide as we can, how many genres would you say appear in the book?
I would say that there are possibly 4. There's the martial arts novel, although it's not necessarily, it's not, I describe it in that way because I think people in this country, in England, would understand what it's like if you call it a martial arts novel.
Yeah.
Because if you refer to it then as a Mandarin Ducks and Butterflies novel, which is basically what it is. I mean, the problem with that term, you know, it was used ever since, you know, the 1920s, 1930s. In a disparaging way to refer to love stories. But, you know, this, of course, isn't a love story, as you've pointed out. There is not one hint of any sort of love interest at all. But it is it is typical of the popular fiction of it. And then there's the urban writing, which I've mentioned before again. And again, I said Bao Tianxiao because he's and you know, I can't recommend enough, if people can read Chinese, reading Shanghai Chunqiu. It is a really great, not very long, but great novel. And then there is this, as I said before, a hint of Gong'an court case fiction. But I think that's probably where it stops. But I think people of the time will have been aware of how close this was to the theatre and how close it was to later on to film. And of course, the book was republished in 1929, I think, as a result of the 1927 film.
It's funny what you said there about the Mandarin. What was it?
Mandarin
Ducks and Butterflies. Yes, about how that began as an insult. I don't have a list. I was trying to get a list in front of me via Google, but I wasn't able to get it up quickly. But I believe quite a lot of genres in different media, the names of the genres begin as insults and then just sort of end up getting adopted. I had one in my head. It's since departed, unfortunately. But yeah, it's interesting how these things can stick.
But we mustn't underestimate the popularity of this. I mean, I think it was more popular. The popular literature of the so-called Mandarin Ducks and Butterflies was much more popular than in the 1920s and 30s than was the new literature, which is basically, you know, what Lu Xun had been writing in the 1920s. Although, of course, that was very popular in itself.
Yeah, something that I find quite amusing about trashy genres is that they receive so much hate from, I guess, culturally elite people, like the fine listeners of this podcast, of course. But they persist anyway. People who love them don't care. But
no,
yeah, Yeah.
I will defend it. I love reading it. One of my favorite novels is Ti Xiao In Yuan, which is another book which is very much in the verging on the martial arts genre, book by Zhang Henshui. Fate in Tears and Laughter, it's called in English. And that is a book I would recommend to anyone. If, again, I mean, I don't think it's been translated into English, which is a great pity. And I had considered doing that myself, but there's so many parts in it that are not, that English readers wouldn't really understand and maybe get a bit bored by, that I haven't done it. Partly also because it's very long if you translate the whole thing.
I found, well, I say I found, this is something as soon as I took an interest in translated Chinese fiction, something I began to think of right off the bat is, well, what gets translated here? Because, a bit of a neurosis I had or developed living in China is realizing how little of an idea everyone I knew back home had about anything about the PRC, either in its present or its history. So I would often be trying to explain it, the things that float to the top of your news feed or chit chat about China, even if they're accurate, they're just one sliver of life there and often have no bearing on ordinary people's lives. So when I started reading translated stuff from Chinese, first for fun, then for this podcast, and then I ended up making that more or less the topic of my publishing master's dissertation, a big fixation I had, which I saw some other academic people had, is why does a lot of the stuff ordinary Chinese people read never make it to English in translation? And of the things that do, what are they? And where I'd go with this is, at first looking into things, I thought, well, everyone, or not everyone, but loads of people back there love these crazy, silly wuxia stories, and loads of people read their fiction online. But why do you never hear about that in English? But over the course of doing this podcast, I've awakened to the fact actually there are so many readers of Chinese wuxia all around the world reading it online, but they're just in their own little underground world, and it's very rarely that something bubbles up to print or to the mainstream. But like, just if you just look on Twitter, there are, I don't think they outnumber the K-pop fans, but it's just a similar massive underground world.
I think it is. It definitely is. And it now crosses over with fantasy fiction and internet fiction of various types. So, there's a crossover there. But fans of wuxia, particularly, you get a lot of talk now about Jin Yong. I mean, you've always had a lot of talk about Jin Yong because he is sort of the grandmaster of the wuxia. And the fact that it's now been translated, a lot of it has been translated. I don't think the whole, all his works have been translated to English yet, but many of them have quite recently. So I would think that's probably a place to go after if you find yourself particularly interested in martial arts novels.
I think we're ready to march on to my next set of questions here. The first is, I've titled it The World Off the Path. So I mentioned that Ma Suzhen kind of goes on a conventional hero's journey, but kind of wanders into a strange book, not in one genre, not even written by one person. So for you, the translator, was this a challenging, unconventional, bizarre task, or was this par for the course for you?
Okay, well, it was first of all, it was a great pleasure to do it, and I enjoyed reading it in the first place, and that's why I decided to do it. But it is written in a specific way, in a antiquated language. It's not literary Chinese, or that has elements of literary Chinese, but it's a sort of the typical antiquated language that it was used in the 1920s and 30s as part of this Mandarin Ducks and Butterflies literature fiction thing.
Right.
Before I did this, I had done a lot of translation of poems and inscriptions. I mean, that's a lot of what my job was at the Ashmolean, and before that, I'd done a lot of inscriptions for antique shops, etc., and collectors. So that was my main experience of translation was poetry and classical Chinese. But then my second book that I wrote, which came out in 2020, Intoxicating Shanghai, I took the unusual step of translating 4 short stories for inclusion in the book. So that was my first experience of writing more things at more length, and those were stories by so-called new sensationists,
Right.
so there are four short stories scattered in this book, which the book is so expensive that very few people have read it, it seems, but which is a great pity for me, not necessary for anybody else. But it would be nice to hear what people think about my translations in those as well. But so I came to this with those tools already. So I done a lot of translation, obviously, over the years, and I came to this book, and it was you ask if it's a challenge translating a lengthy piece of work, although this is quite a short novel, is always a challenge. It's always going to be a challenge, and it was above all great fun.
Right. Now, again, you've set me up so nicely for my next question. It's like someone showed you my questions in advance or something. But yeah, you've thrown me one to knock out the park here. So you mentioned the pricing, and this has actually been on my mind lately for 2 reasons. One is, in my last episode, I added a book that I saw on Instagram, sort of I wouldn't say a friend, but someone who I've seen a few times through the London Chinese sci-fi group, got Mia Chen Ma, got a chapter in this one of these academic books. It's a collection of different chapters, all contributed by different academics, and it was on eco-criticism in Chinese lit. And I was like, wow, fantastic. This is coming out soon. I'll have to put it in my news segment so I can encourage listeners to buy it. I'll just look up the publisher's page so I can put the link in there. Oh, it's £120. Okay. Or for people short on cash, they can fork out £60 for the ebook. That's one reason this has been on my mind. The other is my girlfriend is 3 times smarter than me, and she's got a book coming out through Boy, Dell and Brewer. So she finished a PhD on wolves in Old English Lit, and that's been turned in. Well, she turned it into a book. And it's a bargain by comparison. The hardback is £60, paperback's £20, and the ebook is for some reason the same price as the paperback. I don't understand that, but that's how they're doing it. And the reason these numbers are what they are is this is kind of how book pricing goes in academic publishing.
Well, those numbers are good. I mean, that sounds quite cheap to me, I have to say.
Yeah, £20 it's almost affordable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I should say what prices my books are, because I don't think the publishers would like it. But my first book was more than you've said. It's more than 100. My second book was more than 200. But I must say, the first book is available in paperback much cheaper. So it'd be great if someone could, if people were interested, if they read that in paperback. This current book is expensive.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say how much it is. If you want to say how much it is, that's fine.
It's okay. But yeah, I guess I would say best way to get academic stuff, if you are not a library, if you're an individual human being, it's through library access. That's basically the best way to do it. Or if it's years after the things come out, there might be a secondhand copy floating around. But I didn't want to just make sort of mean comments about money. I wanted to ask about just like readership in general, because when I try and think about readers who might be listening to this show, if I was to put them in a spectrum of like light to heavy, let's say, I might put the academics at the heavy, the heavyweight end, and then the wuxia web novel addicts reading stuff on their phones right at the other. In an ideal world, would you hope that this translation of yours reaches right across the spectrum? Would you want to put them all in a room?
Well, absolutely. I want to. I don't. Well, above all, I should say this is not an academic book.
Right.
The academic side of it is the essay that I've written, and I've actually put that at the end rather than the beginning, so that people will read the story and enjoy it before they read about the story. So it's not an academic book, and that's a pity that it's got an academic face to it, to the public. But so it really is suitable for young and old, and people, and as well as academics, because of course it's an important part of modern Chinese lit, but it can be read by anybody. I think that was the aim was that it, again, as I said, the original was written in a sort of antiquated style, and so I've translated it in an antiquated style. What I'm really against is reading books which were written clearly in maybe even literary Chinese that are translated into straightforward modern English.
Right.
It's very difficult to make the balance and make it in an antiquated English, but I hope I've succeeded.
I think you did. I think especially the voice of the narrator, it was in a particular style, and it felt like, it felt like a book. It felt like an English language book from, maybe the early 20th century, written for a bit of fun and whimsy that I might have picked up off the shelf. But with more Chinese stuff in there. So I think you succeeded there. Okay,
so my inspiration for doing it, I mean, I'm not saying it imitates in any way, but Middlemarch was my sort of, so from that sort of period. So I haven't copied, but it sort of inspired me to write in that way. As I say, I wouldn't compare myself to George Eliot, but
I'm gonna pull up a quote here. He's one of my favorite Twitter users, as well as one of my favorite translators, Jeremy Tiang. He said something rather funny about the question of tone. Yeah, so his tweet was, "I don't care about the meanings of words. I'm here to translate vibes." And obviously he's being a bit flippant there, but the point of like, you need to capture the tone of the thing. If you're just going by definitions of words, you're not going to make something that's very readable. And the reason I like his translations, aside from his excellent vocabulary and word choices and taste in the books he chooses to work on, he produces things that are readable. And that's probably because it's a vibes first philosophy, or at least a kind of a faithfulness or appropriateness of tone, like you've gone for there.
Well, another thing I've done is to, because it's very difficult, particularly with the dialogue. It's just a question in the Chinese. It just says, he said this, she said this, he said this, she said this. That sort of. I've had to add quite a lot to make it make sense, and also taking my lead from David Hawkes and his translation of Story of the Stone, Hong Lo Meng. I have included quite a bit of explanation as well as I've gone along, because otherwise it just wouldn't make sense to an English reading audience.
Right. Yeah. Stop me if this is an awkward one, but you did in the I think in the intro, or again, I can't remember what's in the intro, what's in the essay, but you mentioned that there are actually some sort of technical errors in the book, maybe because it was a bit of a rushed out, cheap job. There's a few things that just don't make sense, and you made the choice as the translator to sort of patch them, put some patches on them. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So there are various parts in the book where, at the most basic, the pages are out of order. So it took me a long time to rejig the pages so that it made sense. But not only the pages. Strangely, some of the actual text seems to be in the wrong place. So I've moved a couple of things around from that point of view. But particularly what I had to change was things that were inconsistent. For example, at the end it says there were 2 murders, blah, blah, blah. In fact, there'd only been 1 murder. And so I had to make a murder happen, for example. But I mean, these are minor things. I think they are. Someone else might think differently. But when I've made a change, I've included it in the introduction, where there is a whole list of the things that I've done. That's another part which makes it an academic book rather than just a book for fun.
Yeah, I remember reading the list of those sort of fixes you made, and my first thought was, well, that's a bit cheeky. But then I thought, no, the cheeky thing would be to do this and then never say you did it, and then get caught 10 years later or something. So
absolutely right. I mean, the thing I wanted to do was make a book that was readable. And in order to do that, if there was something that would clearly stand out to the reader as not making sense, I had to make it make sense.
Yeah. The more academic thing to do would be leave it there and then footnote it saying, by the
Yeah.
way, this is wrong. And I noticed,
Yeah.
look at me.
Yeah, but that spoils the fun for your average reader.
Sure.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Righty ho. So my next set of questions, we've got to the miscellaneous section, so we're making good progress here. So my first miscellaneous question was the Chinese word of the day. Just any word that sort of captures the spirit of the story. What would you select?
I'm going to have to say again, because I've drawn a blank on this. I can't think of a word. So,
Okay. Well, I'm torn in two here because my vocab it's all right, it's not great. So using my simple vocab, I might just go for new, the word for woman, which I've never used before, and is on one hand really relevant because that's part of the reason this one got translated, is the interesting female main character. But then on the other hand, the fact she's a woman feels unimportant at times as well. So that would be my first choice. And my second choice would be going on to Google Translate and looking up the Chinese word for vengeance, which I don't know.
right. Baochou in this
Baochou.
case.
Right.
Yeah, well,
Baochou.
that is a very suitable word for this, but I think every reader would come up with their own decision on what is most important or stands out most to them.
Oh, this is interesting. So I popped revenge. Hang on. Vengeance. Yeah, I popped vengeance into Google Translate and it's given me Fùchóu, not
Yeah,
Baochou.
Fùchóu. No, that's also one. Yeah,
is there a subtle difference between those two?
I wouldn't like to say, but
Right.
I mean, for example, the word Baochou comes in the title of this book, but the word Fùchóu comes in the title of the film from 1970 or 1988, I think it is.
Oh,
so I mean,
interesting.
they mean pretty much the same thing.
Okay, got it. Hopefully that will stay in my memory and I will have learned it. We'll see. Now, my next bonus question, not bonus, what am I talking about? My next miscellaneous question, it's the music question. If you could pair the story with a piece of music, or if you could set it to a piece of music in your own film or stage adaptation, does anything spring to mind?
Well, here we hit on an interesting one because most of my life was spent as a professional musician, so
Oh, right.
music is important to me.
Right.
For this story, I mean, I would have to go for something to do with Peking opera. There are 2 points in the book where music is mentioned. One is in the funeral that I've already mentioned, the funeral of the dignitary at the beginning, where monks are playing music, and Buddhist monks and etc. are playing music. But the other place that music makes the biggest impact is when Ma Suzhen is taken by her host, Madame Chai, to a Peking opera, and she sees a performance of Mu Lian rescues his mother from hell. And she's terrified because of the scenery that depicts all sorts of things happening in hell. But that is the piece. I would think of a piece of Peking opera, Shanghai style Peking opera, Hai Pai as it was known.
Hai Pai, right? Okay.
Yeah, and going when I arrive in Shanghai, which is the place I go to visit most when I go to China, or any city that I visit, I will go to the opera house first of all, and I will buy tickets for every evening to go and watch either Jingju, Peking opera, or any other performances that are happening of that type of thing. So that's one thing that I would pair with this book. But another is Suzhou Pingtan, So the storytelling from Suzhou.
Right.
That is sung to the accompaniment of pipa and sanxian, which is related to the sort of storytelling that I mentioned before, which was just spoken word. But I have never heard a version of this story in Suzhou Pingtan, but I am looking out for one. I should mention, because Qi Fanyo, who is the book is a tribute to, was a writer of Suzhou Pingtan pieces. So, which makes it again very relevant.
Right. That's funny that you named Hai Pai, because that was one of the words of the day in a past episode. Funnily enough,
Right.
We did the Book of Shanghai, and that was the choice.
It's a very difficult word, that, because it basically used nowadays just to refer to Shanghai style. Whereas or the way I refer to it is Hai Pai as Peking opera Shanghai style is the way it was originally referred to. So you had Jing Pai and Hai Pai, Peking opera.
I follow on Instagram. I think on this podcast's account, I follow a few different hashtags so that I can see something whenever it comes up. So like if you follow hashtag Chinese literature, it's a quiet enough hashtag that I see just about everything that comes up. I don't tend to miss anything. And there's a few I follow that get almost no posts. And one of them is Hai Pai. And it seems like, I don't know if it's from Japanese, people using the same characters, or if it has another meaning in Chinese, but sometimes people just take pictures from like their trip to the beach and post it under Hai Pai. So it's literally the sea. I don't know.
I mean, it's come to refer to Shanghai style, anything Shanghai style. So it's changed its meaning over. Of course, in the 1930s, it was a big question of the difference between Jing Pai and Hai Pai. Literature was a big question at the time, but originally it was to do with Peking opera.
Okay, got it. So it's funnily enough, I've also made two musical choices. One is much lowbrow, but it is relevant, I guess. It's because it's gangster rap, and we're dealing with gangsters. So it's by a group called D12. This is very out of fashion now. I think this was the group Eminem was in. So he was in I think they were called D12 because it was the Dirty Dozen, and it was him and 11 not white rappers, 11 other guys from Detroit, all African Americans. This song I've picked is called Shit Can Happen, and it's basically the idea is if you mess with us, something might happen to you. And that's kind of what's driving the action in this book. It's not the book is not nearly as scary as the threats made in the song, but I figured, that's one side of the story. And then the other one, again, I don't know if the content or the story behind this piece of music has anything to do with martial arts or kung fu, but it has that vibe. It's not by a Chinese group, it's by a string quartet group called the Kronos Quartet, and they're I don't really know what their story is, but they seem to be very into covering music from all over the world. It seems like they might be particularly, they might have a particular track record for covering stuff from all over different parts of Asia, be it South Asia, Middle East, or East Asia. But they've got this album called 1,000 Thoughts, which when I came across I downloaded it whilst living in China, because I thought, what a beautiful title. This must be very peaceful, thoughtful music. But actually, it's a very chaotic album because they're doing these string pieces in loads of different styles from around the world. And one of the most chaotic ones is very decidedly Chinese style. It's called The Round Sun and the Crescent Moon in the Sky. And I think it's the only track that's got vocals on it, because right at the start, It's a woman's voice, actually. She does something to call a group to action. I know she's speaking Mandarin. I'm not sure what the first sentence she says is. I'm pretty sure the second sentence is like, 我们开始吧. So like, come on guys, let's start. A little bit like someone in D12 might say like, let's do this, like in a rock or a rap song might do. I knew I was going to use it for one of my musical pairings at some point, and I figured it was a pretty good fit for this story here.
That I've never heard the piece, but I do know the Kronos Quartet because I think I'm right in saying they began in the 1980s and did quite a lot of classical contemporary music, as in avant-garde music.
Mm-hmm.
And I got this idea, and I may be wrong. I would like to check if I'd know. I'd love to check, but I think they play the University Challenge music.
Oh, well, Google is your friend. Let me see. I've got two screens. I'm at a strong advantage here.
Yes.
University Challenge. It's funny. A thing I like about them is, yeah, they're clearly from sort of a highbrow musical world, but they're also on the soundtrack for some quite popular films. They've collaborated with Darren Aronofsky. So admittedly a bit of a highbrow filmmaker. Requiem for a Dream. I'm pretty sure they're in that. They did most of the score for that, which is, that's a film a lot of people know. Don't have to be in the elite to enjoy Requiem for a Dream. I'm not sure. It's brought up a question about them. They were the answer to a question in an episode of University Challenge way back. I'm not sure. It might be someone else. I'm not seeing anything here.
Oh, how strange.
Might be something else. Let me see. I'll try it a different way.
Balanescu Quartet.
Right.
But they're similar.
Okay.
They're similar.
Well, that's that one resolved.
Yeah.
That'll take some
Cut
editing.
it out if you want.
I'll edit that one down so that we solved it in about 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Speaking of editing, so my next question, this is going to be snipped out and put on the show's Patreon for the show's patrons. And the question is this: do you have any strong feelings about any times or places in Shanghai or Shandong? Because like I already mentioned, the sort of Paul French school of China writing, it's pretty easy to obsess over old dirty Shanghai, but like, what about yourself? Are you invested in time and space?
When I was seeing the believe back in evolution, but they saw something like that, it would be
Right, cool. Yeah, I won't try and stretch that one out any further. It's perfectly lovely how it was. So onto our last questions now, the further reading questions. So I think you've given some pointers already. We had Jin Yong, but just generally, if our listeners want more like this book, where would you send them?
Yeah, I had thought of Jin Yong in that regard, but and the other book that I would say is Ti Xiao Yinyuan, which again, I mean, I have to stress that it hasn't been translated to my knowledge into English, but it is one of the great books, and you can watch the film. There are always films of these things. So there's a film. I think there are two films about Ti Xiao Yinyuan. One of them stars Butterfly Wu, and that's no doubt available on any number of places on the internet.
All right. So my last question then, what are you reading just now?
What am I reading now? Well, of course, I read all sorts of different things for my teaching. That's just what I have to do, and of course that's enjoyable in itself, but for my relaxation or for my personal research,
That's right,
at the
motherfuckers,
moment
we
I'm
back.
reading a book
Same
by
slanging,
Shen
orangutan, wildin' out on hood rats to say I act like I'm too famous to say hi and tell her what my name is, but really I'm still nameless. You niggas don't get it yet, do you? Dylan not platinum a flop, I said, oh, it's a surprise.
Picture me sitting in a jail cell, rotten shit, barricaded in a motel with 12 shotguns. So when it come knocking, these hands got one cock, ready to dump slugs, heavy as shot puts. One man army, guns can't harm me. Young and ornery, worse than
all the writings from in the past that refer to Aubrey Beardsley in Chinese. So And then the other book I'm reading, which is in English, a book that you've mentioned Twitter, and this is a book I found on Twitter. I liked the idea of it, and I think it was the author themselves who was commenting on it. This is called Spirits Abroad by Zhen Cho. So what I particularly like about that is the language in it, because it's using what I don't know how one would refer to it, but possibly Malaysian English. And I particularly like that.
Malayalam English.
Yeah.
Doesn't roll off the tongue, does it?
Well,
I usually squeeze in what I'm reading. It's Ramsey Campbell, who I mentioned before. I'm reading his The Searching Dead, and I can actually relate it to things we've hit on in the conversation, because it's definitely genre fiction. It's in the horror genre, sort of. He's I think he got his start being pegged by one of the heirs of Lovecraft, looking for another heir to sort of someone else who could write in that style. He sort of evolved and did other stuff later in his career, but now as an older man, he's come back to continuing, I think, an idea from one of those early stories. So the reason I mention that is it's genre fiction. I kind of know what to expect, and it's fun to read. So it's a breath of fresh air. I'm not reading it out of any real sense of obligation, just curiosity and pleasure. So that's not to be underrated. Thinking yourself into the trap of reading books that aren't fun is one of the worst things I think you can do to yourself as a reader. So that's worth mentioning, I guess. And the other thing is, you mentioned that The Adventures of Ma Suzhen is like appropriate for all sorts of ages. If you're old enough to, or your reading ability is high enough to sort of manage the writing style, it's not difficult, but like I wouldn't give it to say a 7-year-old. If you're fine with that, then anyone can enjoy the book. And if you're an adult who doesn't like, I was about to say if you don't like adult content, you're fine. That's not strictly true, because it does get a bit violent. But if violence isn't an issue, then anyone can read the thing, anyone can enjoy it. And similarly, The Searching Dead, although it does get a bit scary, it's not massively scary. And it's kind of like a English boy in school sort of story. It seems to be a bit of a, like, using his own childhood. It's set in the 50s, post-war Liverpool, and a kid is at school and finds out one of his teachers is up to no good. So it's playing on that genre as well, and it would work just as well as young adult fiction as an adult horror novel, which is how I'm reading it. So yeah, I don't know if anyone's listening and interested in that. It's great. I've powered through it, so I would recommend it. But yeah, all that aside, we've pretty much reached the end. So is there anything at all we've not hit on that you'd like to hit on before we say our goodbyes?
I don't think so. I mean, there's so much to talk about, which we haven't spoken about the story's life in the theatre or in the film very much. But if people want to read about to know about that, they can read it in my essay in my book.
Yeah, it is. I'm not just being nice here. I will say it was one of the, I don't know if I'd say top 10, because I've not been counting, but as explanations of the story or essays included in books that I've read ever or for the podcast, I thought it was very readable. It was a great combo of like in-depth and academic-ish, but also engaging, readable. I remember it being a bit amusing at times. I think it had a bit of the same wryness that's sort of in the narrator's voice at times. So yeah, just, I wouldn't say read the book just for that essay, because that would be doing the story a disservice, but they're a very good joint package. So I think, yeah, that's worth mentioning.
But I think one thing about it is always read the story first. I think otherwise it will be ruined by reading the essay.
Yeah, and we've kind of avoided spoiling the story. We've done no worse than the authors who decided to tell us how it would end in like the first 10 pages. So if they could do it, I think we can talk about what we've talked about. But yeah, I guess I'll just say thanks very much for coming on the show, Paul. I think you're the first Oxford or Cambridge academic to come on the show, so that's a first. Yeah, exciting for me.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope we can do it again maybe, and I hope many more from Cambridge and Oxford will join you.
Okay, we've reached the end of the episode. It's the outro, so not a great deal to say here. Just thanks again to Paul for coming on the show. Of a show that's covered many sort of oddball publications, I think this is one of them. but it was a very interesting one to get to grips with and to be sort of led through by a guy who understands it so intimately. I know I always say this, but what a pleasure it was talking to my guest for this episode. I literally always say it, it's pretty much literally always true. I guess I should end on the traditional plug, which is, well, it is becoming a tradition now. It's the Patreon. That is what keeps the show going, in that it pays the hosting fees, plus a little bit of surplus, which I usually use to buy milk and bread for myself so that I can stay alive. The Patreon has something like, I've actually not been counting, but it's got dozens and dozens and dozens of episodes, about as many as the main feed, although I should say, in all honesty, they're not as long. They tend to average about half an hour, sometimes under, sometimes over. I also put the bonus question snippets up there. Again, full disclosure, that's about 5 minutes that I snipped out of this interview to pop up onto Patreon. Another full disclosure, I queue these things to come out like once every 1, 2 or 3 weeks, a bit like the show actually. It's every 2 weeks right now. So that little bonus snippet won't be going up online till I think like maybe May. I could sync them up more cunningly, but I have not the time. But yeah, every bonus question that's snipped out does go up there eventually. And I also talk about any sort of Chinese or China adjacent book I read in my free time. I put up thoughts on there. And if I'm reading a book for the show, I'll put up additional like solo thoughts about that book on there in audio form. So like most recently, just today, I finished Jottings Under Lamplight by Lu Xun. So when I was halfway through that book, I sort of splurged out my thoughts for half an hour in spoken word form and popped it up on the Patreon. I might do a second one talking more about the book, the post-read thoughts, although I may not do that. I may have got out all my sort of key thoughts first time around. But yeah, as it sounds from the way I'm describing it, the Patreon is quite freestyle. It's pretty much all solo. So if you want to hear me talking just into the mic without a guest, that's, oh man, you've got hours of that stuff up there. So yeah, enough about the Patreon and more about the best thing you can do for the show. If you've been listening for a while, you know where I'm going with this. It's just spread the word. Tell people online, tell people offline. I guess I've always idealized the idea of telling people offline about the show, but perhaps that's not really how people discover a podcast. Maybe online recommendations are more meaningful. That's something an unfortunate reality that I'll have to grapple with, I suppose. But whilst I'm grappling with that, you tell your Kung Fu master, if you have one. Tell the ghost of your deceased brother if you don't have a Kung Fu master. If you don't have a deceased brother, you can tell your living brother. If you don't have a brother at all, you can tell your sister. If you have no siblings, then whisper it in the ear of your enemy before you disembowel him and paint the floor with his guts. By whatever means you were going to use to exact your revenge, it doesn't matter. Just tell that guy, and maybe in his last moments he'll sort of contemplate subscribing to this podcast, and that wouldn't be reflected in the subscription numbers of my show, but I would still think of it as some kind of a boost, and I'll take any boost I can get. So on that note, 再见.